Hi, second graders. I am here to introduce our learning for this week. This week, we are going to be taking what we already know about the parts of a flower that you learned last week and applying it to our new learning, which is about pollination. We are going to learn all about pollination. What is pollination? How does it happen? And we're also going to be discussing what are pollinators, what are the animals that pollinate, and how do flowers get pollinated around the world. So here are our objectives for the week. Students will be able to explain pollination and discuss why pollinators are important. Now, to explain pollination, the sentence that we need to be able to say is, pollination is when blah, 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 blah. This might also be an opportunity where you could use sequence words. Pollination is when blah, 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 blah. First, blah, blah, blah. Next, blah, blah, blah. Then, blah, blah, blah. So you could almost write a whole paragraph with sequence words to explain pollination. The second part of the learning of this week, I'm going to mark it in purple, is that we need to discuss why pollinators are important. Why are the animals that pollinate important to humans and important to Earth? And this is a really important discussion that we will have together and that you can have with your families at home. And are examples of pollinators. So first, you need to be able to tell me what are some pollinators that exist on Earth. Second, you need to start to think about, and you'll be learning with me to answer this question, pollinators are important because blah, 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 blah. Why are they important? What would happen if we didn't have as many pollinators? What would happen if there were less pollinators on Earth? And without pollinators, I want you to think about what would happen to humans if there were less animals pollinating. So I hope that this gets you started with what we're going to be learning about this week. All about pollination and the pollinators that do the work of the pollination. Bye, guys. Okay, second graders, so to start our learning about pollination, we're going to read this book together, and I'll explain as we read. It's titled, What is Pollination? And you can tell by the images that we're already seeing in this book that your brain might be like, oh, that's what it is, or oh, I see a bee, and a bee must be a pollinator. You can already be making some connections. Here's the table of contents, lots that we're going to read about. First, we're going to learn about the pollen. What is pollen? Pollen is yellow, white, or brown powder at the center of most flowers. Pollen is an important food for bees and some other animals. Pollen is a very important part of many flowers. It is the part of a flower that plants need to make fruit, seeds, and new plants. To make new plants, pollen has to move from one flower part to another of the same type of flower. Most flowers need pollinators to move the pollen. Pollinators are animals such as bees, wasps, butterflies, and other small animals that visit flowers. So to pause here, I want you to listen to me for a second. They mentioned this, but it went pretty quick. They said, to make new plants or new seeds, pollen has to move from one flower part to another of the same kind of flower. So here's what this means. If there's a bee buzzing around my orange tree and it's visiting all the flowers on my orange tree, it might go to my one orange flower to another orange flower to another orange flower. And as it visits all those orange flowers, it's moving the pollination or the pollen to the different flowers and therefore pollinating all the orange flowers so that I will then have lots of oranges later in the year. They'll start to grow. Bees don't always visit the same type of flower over and over. Maybe the bee will go to a rose, then it goes to a daisy, then it goes to the orange flower, then it goes to a tomato flower. When a bee visits lots of different flowers and gets pollen from lots of different types of plants, that pollen is not going to pollinate the other flowers. The bee has to go from a tomato flower to another tomato flower for that pollen to rub off. Now, as you can imagine, bees are buzzing around all day and they're getting covered in pollen. So they might have gone to a tomato flower and gotten pollen from a tomato flower on them an hour ago, and now they're visiting a tomato flower. Again, there's still a chance that some of that tomato flower pollen will fall off. But a lot of times, the pollen that rubs off onto the new flowers, it doesn't do anything. It has to be the correct type of pollen from the same type of flower. Okay? So it has to be pollen from the same type of flower. If pollen from another flower gets on it, it doesn't matter. The flower doesn't care, but it's not going to create seeds and fruit. What is pollination? Whoop, there we go. Some flowers have male and female parts. The stamen is the male part of the plant that makes the pollen. Some flowers have one stamen and others have many. The pistil is the female part of the flower. It is made up of the style, stigma, and ovary. The stigma is the top part. It receives the pollen. The style is the pollen tube, and the pollen travels down through the style to the ovary, which contains the ovules. When pollen moves from a stamen to a stigma, pollination has taken place. After a flower is pollinated, its petals fall off. The ovaries of the flowers become fruit, and the ovules become the seeds. The fruit of a plant can be a vegetable or a nut, as well as a fruit. The fruit of the bean plant below are the bean pods. The seeds are the beans inside of the pods. So here we have bees pollinating the flowers. Once they get the correct type of pollen from the other bean plant flowers, then they start to grow the bean pods. And you might notice the flower shrivels up. It's gone. It's just the bean pod growing out of the ovary, this part of the flower. And then in the end, we have the beans that we might eat, but the seeds are inside. Boys and girls, seeds are always inside of fruits. So wherever we eat anything that has seeds, we know that it's a fruit. Even if we're eating a tomato. Tomatoes we might call vegetables, but they're really, scientists call them a fruit. Even if you are eating zucchini and squash or pumpkin and you have seeds inside, it's a fruit. Anything with seeds inside is a fruit. Types of pollination. Flowers cannot make seeds unless they are pollinated. There are three main types of pollination: cross-pollination, self-pollination, and wind pollination. In cross-pollination, flowers need pollen from other flowers of the same species or type to land on their pistils. Animals such as insects and birds may carry pollen from flower to flower. Self-pollination. During self-pollination, pollen moves from the stamen to the pistil of the same flower. Flowers that self-pollinate have male and female parts that are close together, so the pollen can move easily from the stamen to the pistil. Sunflowers can self-pollinate, or they can be cross-pollinated. So sunflowers can do either one. The last type is wind pollination. Some flowers are pollinated by the wind. Wind sweeps the pollen off of those flowers and carries it to other flowers. Wind-pollinated flowers have millions of tiny pollen grains. These flowers seldom have nectar for animals to eat. Ragweed flowers are wind-pollinated. Many people are allergic to ragweed pollen. So a lot of times when people have allergies in the spring and summer, It is because of all of the pollen that is coming off of the different plants. And a lot of it is from wind pollinated flowers. They make so much pollen because they know it's going to be carried in the wind, and they're just hoping, crossing their fingers, that it pollinates another flower of the same type to then create the seeds. But it gives a lot of people allergies. Pollen creates lots of sneezing. Shapes and colors. Most animals pollinate when they look for nectar. Nectar is a liquid that's found in many flowers. The bright colors and sweet smell of a flower tells the pollinators that the flower contains nectar or pollen for them to eat. Flowers that are pollinated at night have very strong sense of smell to make it easier for pollinators to find them. So here's a Luna moth. This animal pollinates at night. Here's an orchid. The type of flower has special markings that guide the insects to the nectar. A paper kite butterfly is pollinating an orchid in this image. Hummingbirds have long beaks and very long tongues. They're able to feed at flowers that are too deep or thin for other predators to reach. And this is a jack-in-the-pulpit plant. It does not smell sweet. In fact, this plant smells like dead meat. This plant attracts flies with its stinky smell, and the flies will then pollinate and move the pollen from flower to flower. Do we need pollinators? Did you know that more than 1/3 of the food you eat depends on pollinators? Pollinators make plants healthier so they can make a lot of food. There are thousands of kinds of pollinators. Most vegetables, fruits, and nuts come from plants that were pollinated by insects, birds, bats, and other small animals. And this has all the foods, some examples of foods that need to come from plants that get pollinated. So without pollinators, we might have less of these foods. Insect pollinators. There are thousands of kinds of insects that pollinate plants. They belong to 5 main groups: bees, wasps, butterflies and moths, flies, and beetles. Without these insects, we would not have many of the foods that we eat. So here's a wasp, here's a moth, a butterfly, a fly, and a beetle, a ladybug. Bees are best. There are thousands of kinds of bees, but the honeybee is the most important pollinator. Honeybees are social insects. Social insects live together in groups called colonies. Each bee colony lives in a hive, which is its home. Bees collect nectar and pollen from flowers. They pollinate many kinds of fruit trees as well as vegetable plants. They also make honey, which people eat. Bumblebees are another kind of pollinator, a bee pollinator. There are about 250 species of bumblebees on Earth. Bumblebees have big furry bodies. Like honeybees, bees live in colonies of 150 to 200 bumblebees. They make their nests underground. The tongues of some bumblebees are short and others are long. The long-tongued bees are important pollinators of many plants, such as beans, tomatoes, and clover. Butterflies and moths. Butterflies and moths have long proboscises, or mouthparts, which can reach the nectar and pollen inside of flowers. Butterflies like bright pink, blue, and purple flowers. Some moths are good pollinators of flowers that bloom at night. They look for pale flowers with strong scents. Wasps and flies. Wasps are mainly carnivores. Carnivores eat other animals. Wasps hunt small insects. Many insects live on the plants. Wasps visit flowers to look for smaller insects that they can find there to eat. They also drink the flower nectar to give them the energy to hunt insects. While the wasps are hunting the insects on the flowers, they pollinate the plants because they're carrying pollen from flower to flower. Wasps also help nature by eating many insects that damage plants. pretending to sting. Flies are very important pollinators because there are so many of them. The most important fly pollinators are hover flies and bee flies, but many other flies also visit flowers to feed on nectar. Hover flies have yellow and black stripes, but they are not related to bees or wasps. The flies, which cannot sting, pretend to be stinging insects to keep other animals from eating them. Beetle pollinators. Beetles visit flowers for many reasons. Some eat the pollen and nectar in the flowers, and some eat the whole flowers. Other beetles feed on the smaller insects that visit the flowers. Smooth or hairy. Beetles that are smooth are not the best pollinators because the pollen slides off their bodies. The best bee pollinators are those with hairy bodies because the pollen sticks to their hairs as they travel from flower to flower. Ladybugs are beetles that feed on small pests such as aphids. Aphids damage the plants. Ladybugs also drink some nectar as a snack to give them energy. Bird pollinators. There are more than 2,000 kinds of birds around the world that feed on nectar or on insects found in flowers. Birds are important pollinators. In North America, hummingbirds pollinate many kinds of wildflowers, especially those with trumpet shapes. Honey eaters are pollinators in Australia and on many islands in the Pacific Ocean. Honey creepers pollinate wildflowers in Mexico and South America. Now it has the Australian flowers, such as this red hot poker, are pollinated by the honeysucker birds. Here is a pollinated by the honey eaters. Here's a honey creeper bird, lizards, bats, and even possums. Animals that hunt insects often pollinate the plants. Small lizards visit flowers to find insects to eat. When they visit a flower, pollen sticks to their bodies. Other animal pollinators include fruit bats and honey possums. Both eat nectar and pollen. The honey possum is one of the few mammals that eats mainly nectar and pollen. Its long snout and tongue reach the nectar and pollen inside of the flowers. Besides eating fruit, fruit bats visit flowers in the dark to eat nectar and pollen. And this is a green anole lizard. It's looking for insects in the pink flowers. Pollinators in danger. Pollinators are very important to us. Without them, we would not have fruits, vegetables, nuts, honey, or chocolate. These important animals are disappearing from Earth. When people build in wilderness areas, animals lose their homes and their food. Pesticides and diseases are also killing many of the pollinating insects. As we lose our pollinating insects, we also lose our food supply. One of the most important pollinators, honeybees, are disappearing and no one really knows why. So this last page is all about how the scientists are recording fewer and fewer honeybees. Let me read it. Each year, there are fewer honeybees. The use of pesticides has killed many bees. Bees are also being killed off by two types of mites that have moved into honeybee hives. The bee on the right has mites on its body. So these mites, I don't know if you guys can see it, but they are these little bugs that are attaching themselves to the bees, and this is a varroa mite. Here's a big picture. It attaches itself to a bee and feeds on fluids from the bee's body. The bee on the right has been treated for mites with powdered sugar. The sugar causes the mites to fall off the bees. So this is just one issue, and these mites are one problem for the bee population, but there's other things that are causing pollinators to be less and less, especially bees. It mentions pesticides, which are the chemicals we spray on plants to help them grow big and strong and keep the bugs away. It also mentions their own diseases for bees too, and simply us killing the bees. So helping pollinators. The best way to help pollinators is by telling everyone about why they are so important. Most people may think that bees, wasps, flies, beetles, and moths are pests. you and your friends can design posters to hang around the school or around your house in your community to let people know about why our food supply depends on these helpful animals. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. See you later.